You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Welcome to Unbiased Science,
where we bring scientific method to the madness.
We're your hosts, Dr. Jess Dyer
and Dr. Sarah Scheinman.
And today we are joined by a very special guest. We'll introduce him in just 1 second. But the topic has been inspired by the MAHA movement and the fact that food and diet and nutrition are top of mind for everyone. It's very topical. Everyone's talking about food and diet. So we're welcoming Dr. Kevin Klatt to the podcast to talk about all things food and diet and nutrition related. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me on.
Welcome, Kevin. And yeah, you guys, there's no one better to be coming on to talk about this stuff. I'm just going to read his bio real quick and you'll know why in a second. So Dr. Kevin Klatt, PhD RD, is an assistant research scientist and instructor in the Department of Nutrition Sciences and Toxicology at UC Berkeley. Kevin received his PhD in molecular nutrition from Cornell University and completed his dietetic internship at the National Institute of Health Clinical Center. Kevin's research aims to better characterize nutrient metabolism, signaling, and requirements using in vitro and animal model systems, as well as human intervention and controlled feeding trials. Kevin is an associate editor at the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Kevin, welcome to the pod. Thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on.
All right. So, Kevin, maybe a good place to start the two letters after your name, RD. What does that mean? Let's set the stage. Let's talk about what a dietitian is.
And maybe also to distinguish it between also a nutritionist, because like these are two terms that I often hear used sort of interchangeably.
Same.
But I feel like maybe there's a difference.
There is.
Yeah, this is a question I get a lot, including from like deans of medical schools that I work with, who are like, what is an RD? So RD is like a protected title in the United States where you have to go through a set series of coursework and then a 1,000-hour clinical internship where you're basically, it's coursework that is everything from chemistry and physiology and food science, food management, public health. It's sort of this gish glop of things where you get to be a jack of all trades, but you can imagine a practitioner in food really has to kind of understand everything from food at the molecular level all the way and what's happening in the body when it's eaten all the way up to like how food is regulated, food safety, et cetera. So it's a really broad, expansive curriculum. And then you go apply that in a clinical internship where you're doing everything from like working on the food service line in the hospital to going and working in school lunches to like calculating, tube feeding and enteral nutrition or parenteral nutrition, like IV nutrition, where people whose guts don't work at all and need to be totally fed by IV. And that can be everything from adults to newborn premature babies. And so it's a really, I think, a fun career path. It's, dietetics historically grew out of the field of home economics. So it's been sort of hampered by this pretty sexist idea of like, oh, it's a woman's field. So like the field is still 90% plus women. I think they sent out an email like being like, we hit 3% men. Woo!
Wow, congrats.
Yeah, it's very rare that it's like I was in a stats class once in grad school and they were like, raise your hand if like men, and they were saying it's sort of like, of course, men dominate in all fields. Like, raise your hand if men don't dominate in your field. And I was like, I'm not trolling. But yeah, so once you do your internship, you do those 1,000 hours and you meet all these competencies that have to be met. You take an exam, and then after you pass the exam, you can use the RD title. It's a little bit different. I think people think of it like MD, but MD is a degree. Right. RD is not a degree. The continuing certification. And so you have to maintain that over time. with like continuing education credits like other medical practitioners have to do. So it's a medical credential, but not all RDs work in medicalized settings, but many of them are employed in hospitals, really focused on inpatient nutrition and preventing malnutrition. It's not great to not be eating at all acutely. And so we try to address that, deal with like a whole range of food related concerns. You can imagine in pediatrics where you have like extreme picky eating, which you call ARFID, you're working on that sort of thing. And we liaise with a lot of other practitioners too, like speech language pathologists that are dealing with swallowing evaluations and things. And so it's a really fun field. I would pitch it to folks. It's rooted in science, but has like a lot of practical application. And it's the only real credential in America that is pretty reasonably regulated as like sort of a established training program and what it means to go on and be like a food and nutrition practitioner that's qualified.
So then what's a nutritionist then?
It's not really regulated in America. And I want to make it very clear, because every time I talk about this, European colleagues will jump down your throat. Other places in the world, it is like the terminology is totally different. Like if you go to the UK, they have a regulated term around like a nutritionist, like a registered nutritionist, and they have registered dietitian. And a registered nutrition has more practice credentialing systems than here. I mean, I know really amazing PhDs and who work in nutrition more like in a coaching type setting and call themselves nutritionists. But unfortunately, people who just wake up one day and decide that they have some expertise in nutrition, often it's people who are like lifting and have an aesthetic that people are looking for, that then start to sell nutrition and their diet and their thoughts on diet. But that's not really regulated in any way. The only thing, I think the major differentiator is like dietitians really have control over or like federal protection around medical nutrition provision. But there's limited enforcement of all these things. So nutritionist could be like somebody who did a 2-day like weekend coaching thing, somebody who did nothing, and somebody who did a PhD but isn't an RD. And so you really have to vet further if somebody's using the term nutritionist. It is I think, widely appealing term. Like people like to think like, oh yeah, you see a doctor or you see a nutritionist.
Right.
There needs to be like a PR campaign that it's like, switch out that nutritionist for dietitian if you want somebody with like clear training. I would love it if we had some sort of broader regulation around the term nutritionist, but these things are so hard to enforce. The line between what is regular general population nutrition and what is more individualized and medicalized nutrition is really thin sometimes, particularly when you're in a population that's 70% overweight and obese, high prevalence prediabetes. Like, when does giving diet advice cross that line into becoming medical advice is an area that's a hot topic. And you see occasional court cases about this. Like, there's like some sort of kind of ketogenic diet fan a few years back that told a lactating woman over the internet to go keto. And there was a big, I think this was in Florida, somehow CrossFit got involved.
Oh my God.
There's a lot of opponents you can imagine politically to like regulating the term of nutritionist and the practice of nutrition, because you've got everything from supplement industry to alternative practitioners who don't want regulations around this or protections around the title. But yeah, it's a whole minefield of a profession. But if you're looking to get into nutrition professionally, if you're listening, or your kid is or whatever, I would encourage going the dietitian path. It might be overkill in some sense if you're not really trying to do the more medicalized stuff. But I think when you get into nutrition, it's always good to have that background sort of knowledge of what the physiology, the chemistry, the food science is before you go and practice in any area of nutrition.
So, Kevin, I always joke that maybe the silver lining of the COVID pandemic is that it put public health on the map. Like, now people know what public health is. And I feel like now with MAHA, the Make America Healthy Again movement, it's really put nutrition at the forefront of all the conversations. So I don't know if you'd call that a silver lining. I'm super curious, what you think about MAHA, but the reason I want to start here is you're touching on something. You're distinguishing between the training that MDs get, for example, and someone who's a dietitian. And something that I've heard a lot of the folks who are a part of the MAHA movement say is, well, doctors, they don't get any training in nutrition and diet. Our society, it's all about pushing pills. We're not focusing enough on things like the foods that we eat and this idea of using food as medicine. I know I threw a lot out there, but what do you think? Like, maybe we could just set the stage. Like, what do you make of the MAHA movement, and how has it impacted the discussion around diet and nutrition? It's a loaded question.
Yeah, it's
big questions off the bat.
Right, that's the rest of the podcast. Is just me responding to that. It like, as somebody who's been immersed in nutrition stuff for the past 10 plus years, like, food and nutrition, I think, is always at the forefront of my news feed. I would say there's been a political rearrangement around food, like things that are now being said in the MAHA movement. It's obviously more right coded. It's the same stuff that was being said 10 years ago on the left. And like, I always joke that I'm like pretty progressive, but I was also pro GMO or not fear mongering about genetic engineering back in 2013. And that did not make you friends on the left. Mm-hmm. And now that doesn't make you friends on the right. And there's just been, like, I think across the political spectrum, we've sort of just thrown everything into the air, and it's really hard to define left or right anymore. But I think it's obviously like having a political administration in power that's like centering this a whole bunch more and has all control of all three parties of the government makes it seem like it might be taken a bit more seriously. I think there's probably people like screaming Michelle Obama as they're listening to this if they know anything about food policy, because if you go back like a decade, Michelle Obama really tried to make food a thing and like kids in school nutrition a thing, and got totally pilloried on it. And it got politicized. She got called the food police and everything. And now the same people who called her the food police 10 years ago are now like, eating beef tallow fries on their show. And so like, and supposedly backing the MAHA movement. And so like nutrition, I think the good part of it is that like, it's always sort of been bipartisan. Like, just if you remove all the externalities, like everybody wants a healthy food system, hopefully, and to feed their kids healthy food and feed pregnant people healthy food. And so I think it should be bipartisan. It's obviously gotten super partisan. I think a lot of people in academic nutrition, where you've seen all of your partnerships as things that are typically more left coded, where it's like, how do we address major public health threats around like sodium in the food supply, saturated fats, all these things that we think are diet elements that are linked to chronic diseases. The allies have shifted, and it's gotten weird. Like, I mean, it's in strange bedfellows where you've got people really saying we need to do something about food, and everyone's kind of like, yeah. And then they're like, and we also need to take out the vaccines. And like, there's no placebo control. It's just the amount of misinformation. It's like, well, I don't want nutrition to win at the expense of like immune health. And these things are in like chronic disease and immunology, or, sort of immunity, have been, I think, falsely dichotomized, and they're actually like quite highly interactive in a scientific sense. And so, the MAHA energy, it's like, I understand that it's inspiring. Like, I'm glad there's a bunch of people like realizing that like we really need to do something about food. You can go back very far in nutrition into like nutrition and chronic disease really came about just at the era of preventative medicine, where you get like large cohort studies that are starting to like look for modifiable risk factors for particularly cardiovascular disease in like the 50s. And so you get like the first feeding studies showing that replacing animal fats with vegetable fats like lowers cholesterol levels in the late 1950s. And then there was quite a battle over the next couple of decades of like, is this meaningful? Is this medical treatment, or is this something we should be giving as a general population type recommendation? But there was a lot of enthusiasm, particularly like in the late 1970s, that led to the first dietary guidelines around like diet to prevent chronic disease. And you've like, it was taken seriously at the time, but then like I think there's like major food industry and agricultural interests to like not shift things or just allow the free markets to be what they are. And like apart from it, we have a few wins research wise and identifying like, the sodium blood pressure links, fat composition and LDL cholesterol. Obviously, obesity is a major risk factor for chronic diseases. Beyond that, we don't have the strongest diet chronic disease risks or like links, and it's typically again like been more advocacy on the left, organizations that have really pushed for effort on this. So it's, I guess, to answer your question, it's like good to see all the political spectrum I ostensibly want to like tackle this issue more, but coming, I guess, from like knowing the history of all of these things, like we haven't even funded the research all that seriously. And it's actually the funding for it has gotten much worse over time. We can kind of get into that if you want. But like we are operating on pretty slim evidence in a lot of these cases. And I think, that's going to be a huge barrier. It's actually something I've written on Substack encouraging MAHA to do. It's like, okay, well, nutrition has been ignored, particularly in the past couple of decades. Nutrition, like our infrastructure and capacity to study food and its impact on health has gotten worse and worse and worse. And so I'm like, you guys could reverse course on that for sure. But all these things that they say that they want to do and they want it to be science-based, I'm like, you're going to run into like some evidentiary challenges.
Right. I would say one of the big things too that's sort of making the rounds right now in terms of like the media and like is big sort of front and center in the MAHA movement is these controversies and new regulations surrounding food dyes. So can you maybe talk to us a little bit about that? Like what's going on with food dyes these days? Like what's the buzz? Why are they bad for you? Are they going to give you cancer? Are they going to give you autism? Like they seems like food dyes are the new antichrist.
Yeah. I mean, I think like at a high level, a lot of people in nutrition find like it a bit frustrating. So like food dyes might seem like an easy win. Like, okay, get these like synthetic petroleum based dyes out of our food supply. Like, and of course it's like, and if that greases the wheels for future legislation around food, like I'm like, sure, I don't really care about food dyes. Like you want bland looking food, fine. But I think the concern is that there's been like extreme hyperbole around the food dyes and like what the public health win that taking them out will be. And so like food dyes are, they're added to food. They have like a really long history in the US. And it's kind of interesting. Like it's sort of at the genesis of the FDA and food regulations where people were like, oh, like companies are adding like mercury and lead, which have a color to them, to food products. And that's not safe. And so you see this evolution over the 20th century of like regulations of food additives generally, and that food colorings actually get their own separate category, sort of because of, you'll learn this about a lot of, I think, things in regulation, probably generally, but especially food. Like it's quite adaptive to issues, and it just grows and evolves over time, and it might not be the way you'd want the system to be if you just sat down and planned it out, but it's more, I think most regulation is quite responsive. And so food colors get this like separate categorization than food additives in America, partially because this history of particularly egregious things being added to food to provide color that are unsafe, or being added to foods that have been spoiled, or some aspect of their quality has been reduced to add color to it so that it's looks more appealing to consumers. And so the government stepped in. Obviously, that's a good thing. And then you have a lot of evolution in like the 1950s, 1960s kind of era to regulate, to list out like what food colors are provisionally allowed and then actually have them registered. And so they are actually exempt from, you can't just like get them exempted and seen as generally recognized as safe. You have to like federally register them for use as a colorant. And then they've evolved over time. Things like the Delaney Clause came into play, where like no food additive or colorant that can potentially cause cancer in humans or animals can be allowed. And so you actually see like a large number of colorings that have been used and like a decrease in the number of ones that are allowed over time within the US. And they've been controversial at various points. I wrote a bunch on Substack about the history of red number 3 or erythrocene, which was, I think, the more recent, actually the only real federal action. So it's like its status is being recognized as safe and approved as a use food additive or food colorant was withdrawn because technically there's arguments about whether it should have been withdrawn, but there were efforts to withdraw its approval in the 90s because it caused a thyroid cancer in mice or rats.
Rodents.
In rodents. Yeah. It's not. This is like it gets into it. It's not all rodent species, so I think it's a rat thing.
I think it's rat.
And so like it's a very specific to the biology of rodents, of rats and their thyroid stimulating hormone levels. And so they have like a very odd thyroid tumor that we think is like a mechanism that's totally unrelated to humans' thyroid cancer risk. And so the fact that it wasn't like primarily genotoxic, like it wasn't causing cancer itself, it was like a secondary tumor due to like a endocrine effect that is species specific, that was tumor promoting only in that species, sort of like puts it in a gray area for Delaney. It's like, okay, well, this isn't like causing cancer, it's causing an endocrine disruption. And so there were efforts to remove it in the 90s, but like it wasn't really seen as a public health threat. FDA has extremely limited resources to try and do tons of things on food. And so it looks bad on paper, but sort of seems like FDA more or less didn't get around to it. And then there's been, as MAHA has sort of risen, I think a good thing about MAHA is that it's been putting, people always say the Federal Drug Administration when they say FDA. It's like, no, it's the Food and Drug.
Oh my gosh, I've never heard that.
It's like an inside joke in the government of like, people forget that the F stands for food. And so putting pressure on FDA to do things about food, I think is good, but that pressure doesn't go anywhere without funding. And so you don't get user fees on the food side like you get for drugs. And the food side has to cover everything from like microbiological safety and contamination all the way through like health and chronic disease. And I think the chronic disease piece has sort of taken a hit. So not to go off on a total tangent, but there's a lot of doging of the government happening while there's this MAHA energy, and MAHA energy would basically require a massive investment in the F side of FDA, hiring on food toxicologists and regulatory folks, and then the FDA staff is getting cut. So it's like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing here, and it's running totally counter to its mission. But so that's like an example of, I think, like that put food dyes on the map. A lot of people will be like, oh, the EU doesn't approve it. It technically has a very similar acceptable daily intake level in the EU that it does in America, but they have more restricted uses of what products it can be in. And there's a lot of what I kind of call Euro fantasizing, where people are like, we should just stop the European system.
Yes.
Euro fantasizing. I like that.
No, you're so right, Kevin. I mean, we've written a ton of Substacks. We've done a ton of content infographics on this idea that in the US, we don't take food safety seriously. Look at all these things other countries are banning. And I went to Italy and I felt amazing. And I'm thinking, yeah, you were on vacation in Italy for 2 weeks.
Right.
That have contributed to you feeling like a different person. But you're right. And
yeah, you didn't get the US news cycle. That alone is therapeutic. Not good.
But we do take a different approach, right? We take a risk-based approach in the US, and Europe and other places take a precautionary approach, and they're pitted against each other and distorted.
On that note, that's said a lot, but if you look at the like 10,000 additives that are approved both in the US and the EU, they overwhelmingly come to the same conclusion. It's like that like, I think it's those examples where you find differences, you'll find people invoke like, oh, we take more of a risk-based approach. They take more of like a precautionary hazard-based approach. But that's like maybe in that single example. And it's really hard to speak in generalizations because there's thousands of food additives that are used for different reasons. But overwhelmingly, they're coming to the same conclusion using a similar framework, like with modifications and adaptations that are both in the way that they look at it from a framework perspective, but also like considering like what estimated intakes are going to be. And based on the European diet being different than the US diet, like they're going to come up with different levels of exposure and what acceptable concentrations to be used in food can be. And so you'll find nuances for like totally practical, not really like risk-based reasons that come out. And so the reasons for like differences are myriad, but I'm always struck by how many, like there aren't many differences. And where there are some differences, like there's also just historical things. Like the US has been around for, like our FDA has been around for over 100 years. The EU comes about what, 93, I think. And then it's like they grandfather in, like EFSA grandfathers in tons of things that were like considered safe use before 1997. And then they have like E numbers given to specific additives after that fact. And so there's like lots of, the people always be like, there's only 400 additives with an E number, and there's 10,000 additives in the US. And I'm like, yeah, there's like also thousands of chemicals that were just grandfathered in because they were considered safe use. And so there's all these like nuances where I regularly see articles being like, this is banned in the EU and it's not in the US. And then you go look and the EU has the same acceptable daily intake. You know. They're looking at the same toxicology data. And there are like legitimate things that I think the US like could be a little bit more aggressive, like the brominated vegetable oils and things that are now getting phased out, or I think are no longer GRAS approved. Like there are some examples where I think it's been a funding and oversight issue with the FDA where they just like haven't focused on food enough. But for the most part with colors, like I mean, I want to say this is a cross section in time on May 8th, 2025, because everything is changing in an influx, but there are some synthetic food dyes, and the literature on this is so messy that there is like a signal for a small effect on worsening hyperactivity symptoms in kids who already have ADHD. And it's like, I believe it's like, you know, there's differences and there's no effective parent reported outcomes, but there's some effective teacher reported outcomes. How you do these studies is and like assess hyperactivity in kids is really difficult. And they're often using mixtures of dyes, sometimes like using ones that are approved in the US and not approved in the US because all the data doesn't come from the US studies. And so it's really hard to say anything about like any single, I see lots of people like saying, oh, this dye is terrible. And then you go to the meta-analyses of these things and it's like, there's constant caveats at every aspect of the design and the outcomes. And that's like, you could totally argue here. I think like we should just get them out of food. And it's like, okay, like then consumers are going to have to deal with a much blander food or attempts by the industry to phase out the synthetics to bring in more natural dyes, which are a potential option. They also bring their own risks, like with allergenicity. So like some of the pediatric food allergy groups have come out being like, we actually don't have data. Like, you know, part of, you can fear monger about artificial dyes if you want, because there's like decades of data on it. There's not decades of data. I see this a lot in the skincare debates where people are like talking about, well, we should remove this and use this like harmless alternative. And it's like, well, actually, we almost have no data on all these alternatives. We're just going to like figure it out as we go. And there's similar theoretical concerns with some of them. So the natural ones are harder to use, less stable. You know, the dyes typically have to be water soluble, and so a lot of the natural pigments are not as easy to work with. They're not as good, basically, as some of the more petroleum-based synthetics. And so, yeah, like we can take them out, we can replace them. I don't know that that's like necessarily a guaranteed risk-free thing. And then, I mean, I think a reality for industry is that they're trying to buy time right now to find alternatives, but we might just get blander looking food for a little bit.
Well, it's so funny, not funny at all, but like this topic elicits the greatest vitriol. Like people saying, how could you possibly argue against removing these things? It's such a good thing that we're removing the artificial dye. I mean, people double down. This is such a hot button issue. And my whole thing is to what you said. I mean, they're not adding nutritional value, right? It's not like we need them in our food. So sure, you want to remove them, but removing them is not going to improve our health. It's not going to actually do anything. It feels like we're focusing our efforts on all the wrong things, you know?
There's there's like a replacement issue of like, does this really reduce meaningful risk? And then there's the like issue that like people are like, how can you be a dietitian and not be excited about removing these synthetic things? And I'm like, because like hot Cheetos with less red dye are still
hot Cheetos. Right? Yeah.
I'm not going to recommend like patients or clients to be eating like, I'm still for all the foods, most of the foods that you're adding a lot of these dyes to, they are minimal nutritional value. Like they taste good and like are fine as snacks and all. But if you're eating the amounts of them that the dye is like a toxicological issue, we've run into like many other nutritional problems along the way. And so when you throw up your hands and say, we won by like getting out food dye, it's like, okay, well, there's like 50 other things in these products that I would have like ranked a lot higher if we're talking about reformulation of the food products in the food system. And I don't see any conversation about those things. And those are much harder battles. And that's so I'm like, if the food dye thing is an entry to like an easy political win, like, and then we're going to do more serious things after, like, great. Like, I'm not going to like run interference to it, but I just see hyperbole about the supposed health effects of these things, and then no action coming beyond that. And I think what is most concerning to me is like we talked about, like, there's lots of regulations around food dyes, but there's not. You're seeing political sort of circusry and like people saying, oh, like we've come to, I think the FDA said they came to an agreement with industry about removing out food dyes. And then the next day the industry came out and was like, oh, we didn't have an agreement. And to phase out these artificial dyes. And then like the food industry is already dealing with the fact that states are on a state by state basis banning these things, which makes commerce and trade like a total nightmare. And so there's already been a long arc of like, because the EU trades with the US, and the US trades with and lots of countries trade. So there's like a desire from an economic perspective for like a harmonized, like, we don't want different dyes approved in different states, let alone different countries, so that we have to like reformulate constantly. And so the industry has been moving towards like harmonizing which dyes they're using that are approved in as many places as possible. And it seems like the administration's trying to take credit for that by saying they came to an agreement with the industry, and the industry's kind of like, no. And what feels the most unserious to me is this administration has the legislative branch and the judicial they basically have the judicial branch, and they have the presidency. And so there's nothing stopping them from changing things at the level of the FDA on policy and changing things at the legislation level about food. And we've seen no action towards that. So like I had a lot of people being like, how are you like against this? Like they reached this historic deal with the industry. How are you not excited about it? I'm like, I don't see anything. They just announced something that didn't happen. And then worse, in some ways, like, you know, the language around this is these evil companies are putting toxic ingredients in our food, kind of adopting from, I think, the environmental law perspective or framing. But I'm like, so now we're partnering with the evil companies, relying on their goodwill to change the food supply. Like, I'm like, no, you have all the levers of power. Like,
yeah, what I'm hearing from you, Kevin, is that like with this conversation around food dyes is like we're kind of missing the point as far as like prioritizing things that need to change. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, you look at the food supply, like the term ultra processed.
I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah. Let's talk about that too. Like,
it is a nice, easy catch-all term to basically mean like grain-based desserts and sodas and lots of sugar-sweetened things that we would like people to eat less of, and like frozen meals that are like sodium bombs, have no fiber. Like there's a whole bunch of things underneath that umbrella, but it's a convenient way to talk about these things. Like when most of more than half of the American diet is ultra-processed foods, the risk associated with that is not because of food dyes. And so where are we going to start to, like, when we pick apart that term and look at what most of the American diet is and realize that it's like, it hasn't been aligned with nutritional guidance since the origins of nutritional guidance, and hasn't really gotten much better over time. Like, how do we really start to look at the entire food value chain from what we grow to what we economically incentivize to how it's manufactured, produced, and like lands either in a product or on our shelves and gets turned into edible food? Like, we have to look at every single aspect of that and really make decisions about what levers can we press to improve the food supply without causing like economic collapse or anything. And I don't see any serious conversation about that happening, but I see enthusiasm that we're getting all the chemicals that cause obesity and cancer out, supposedly.
Major air quotes.
That hyperbole.
Right.
Yeah.
Crap, this is a video podcast. So it is that like that hyperbole coupled with no serious action on the real. I don't see any policy plans laid out. There's no roadmap. Like, and you couple with this, like we can get into the infant formula thing too, like very unserious language coming out in Operation Stork Speed with no tangible plans. And I'm like, you have all the levers of power. Where is anything tangible is what I would like.
Okay, we have to, just going back to the hot flaming Cheetos. So just talking about things like ultra processed foods, because that is such a buzzy topic right now. So my approach, and I am not a dietitian, has always been like, these things are not adding nutritional value, but they're also not inherently harmful, like the fact that they are ultra processed. But then to your point, ultra processed foods are also typically like sodium bombs, or they have, other things added to them. So can we just talk about, like, should we be terrified of ultra processed foods? Should we I'm just not typically in the business of this is good, this is bad, avoid this, total abstinence from ultra processed foods. What would you say?
And also, Kevin, could you maybe define ultra processed foods for us? Because this is a term that I hear thrown around a lot, but what does it mean as a dietitian, as someone who's credentialed in this field? What does that mean to you, that term?
Well, so it's new. Its origin is in 2009. So many dietitians trained. I mean, there's a lot of viral videos going around, I think, from our Casey Means going around being in medical school I wasn't taught this. And I was like, yeah, you probably weren't taught this because none of this data existed. It's really in the past less than 2 decades that the term was introduced. There's sort of a critique that we focused a lot on nutrients and we focused on foods and dietary patterns, and that there's technically always been an emphasis in nutrition guidance on processing, but it's sort of an indirect way. And a Brazilian epidemiologist said, wrote this paper. It's it's not the food or the nutrients, it's the processing, and sort of proposes this. And the term evolves over time, but it's essentially there's a NOVA classification is what it's called. It's a 4-tiered system where you have essentially natural foodstuffs, very lightly processed things like sodium and oil, and then as tier 2, and then tier 3 is when you take tier 1 products and tier 2 products. So if you add an oil on top of vegetables, that would technically be a lightly processed food. But then, or minimally processed, they call it minimally processed, or natural food stuff, minimally processed, and then ultra processed is some version of this. And so the ultra processed is really, they emphasize the use of industrial ingredients that you can't find in your home or likely to be in your kitchen. And so this can be any number of things, from food additives, preservatives, colorants would be a thing. There's sort of wax and wane on whether vitamins. I think now if you add riboflavin to something, it's not ultra processed, although most people probably recognize it as that because it's a scary sounding chemical term, but it's just vitamin B2. But then there's the use of isolated nutrients like starch bulking agents like maltodextrin. Many things can make something ultra processed. And so when you go, it gets complicated when you go to the scientific literature on this, I think, because different countries eat lots of different foods, and many of those foods would be they might have their ultra processed foods, but they're wildly different than our ultra processed foods. What the EU is eating, we don't eat a lot of these processed sausages or anything. And so lumping this all together in a meta-analysis gets pretty complicated. But most of the ultra-processed foods in America are things grain and meat-based dishes, sugar-sweetened beverages, grain-based desserts like a muffin, things that you wouldn't, a Pop-Tart, you wouldn't think oh, these are health foods. But then I think some of the critiques of ultra-processed foods is that the umbrella is so huge, a protein powder is an ultra-processed food. Most almond milks and soy milks are ultra-processed foods. A lot of yogurts would be an ultra-processed food, just because they added a slight preservative to it. And so you have mostly observational epidemiological data where you've given people food surveys, ask what they eat, and then follow them up over time that is comparing mostly grain-based desserts and sugar-sweetened beverages all like collapsed into this umbrella term of ultra-processed foods compared to people who don't eat those things, which unsurprisingly, people who eat really high amounts of them, I think, have worse health outcomes. That can be due to both the foods that they're eating and also just all the confounding factors that differentiate people who eat high ultra-processed foods versus low. And epidemiologists try to adjust for these, but it's extremely difficult to do accurately. And then you're comparing Pop-Tarts and spinach, basically, in the epidemiological data. And then I think a lot of the pushback on them has been like, there's a lot of ways, a lot of things that you can do to foods to just like otherwise pretty healthy things that preserve them. Like if you compare a homemade refined grain bread, that's not going to be an ultra processed food if you just rely on like white flour and salt and yeast and maybe a little fat. But then if you go to the store and you buy a whole grain bread with all the same ingredients, but like an industrial preservative that makes the shelf life longer, I think most dietitians would be like, yeah, eat the whole grain bread. Mm-hmm. But that's the UPF in this case. And so those comparisons that you have to deal with as like a shopper in real time or somebody recommending diets is not the reflected reality of what the data is, where you're comparing sugar sweetened beverages and muffins to people who eat fruits and vegetables. So there's concerns about what we call UPF, of they're both like things you would imagine to be somewhat healthy and a lot of things you would imagine to be somewhat unhealthy on that umbrella, and then what your comparator group is in the so it gets quite wonky, and you can imagine how this is also extremely collinear with things like socioeconomic status. So like these food surveys that we're giving out to people do not typically capture like the degree of detail that you might imagine. They're often getting food groupings and categories, and data has been collected for 20 plus years before we've had this UPF term. So they're not getting information on like, okay, did your soy milk have carrageenan in it? Probably does. Like it's like it doesn't have an emulsifier that makes it a UPF. So like it probably does, but there's a chance for misclassification error. There's so yeah, I mean, it gets super complicated. All to say that like most of the things that you would think of as a UPF, maybe intuitively as like an educated consumer, you'd be like, of course, Pop-Tarts, we shouldn't be eating lots of them. Why wouldn't you be railing against UPF? But then it's like, I don't worry about recommending a protein powder to somebody because it's a highly processed thing that technically qualifies as UPF. I don't worry about like somebody who's vegan and is getting a soy milk that has like an emulsifier in it or something in it. Like, and that's, I think there's like a very classist issue that comes into play here really quickly. So I am reticent to just say like, don't eat ultra processed foods because there's so much heterogeneity under the umbrella of the, but it's also extremely convenient. I'd like to be like a lot of things that would fall under that umbrella that it just captures in one fell swoop. So I understand the appeal, especially for public policy.
So this
people.
is such a painful question to ask, and don't hate me for asking it, but I think our listeners would really appreciate it. Like, is there anything that you, as a brilliant dietitian, that you would recommend to your patients or clients to avoid typically to avoid at all costs? Like, is there anything that you would put in the just don't eat this or don't drink this category? And then B, is there anything that you really emphasize that we should be eating?
I mean, so the framing of this, you're right. I do hate this.
I'm so sorry. I know. But we get forced into this. The reality is so nuanced. And so, of course.
And there, I imagine there's no one size fits all with regards to, something like this. I'm sure it matters.
The point is that, of course, those things matter, but everyone wants these very black and white, right? Like recommendations to do or not to do.
Right. Until recently, I would have told people like avoid all things with industrial trans fats in them. Like, but we've phased those out. I think like the next in your obvious low hanging fruit public health, nutrition recommendations is like all sugar sweetened beverages. There's like unless you have like a kid that's severely underweight or something, you're just trying to get any calorie in. Like for the most part, like sugar sweetened beverages at a population level, they're not adding anything. Most people are likely to overconsume them. All of these things, like the dietitian part of my brain comes in because like the moment you say avoid sugar, the moment you have like a kid with cancer who has to be fed a tube feeding formula that has sugar in it, I mean, I've seen parents who are like, you're feeding my kid poison. And I'm like, no, the context here like matters so much of like people who are not at risk of malnutrition, who are adding sugar sweetened beverages on top of their or into their dietary pattern, and it's pushing them into like a caloric surplus, particularly like this is the concern. And generally for most Americans, there's a likely benefit from restricting these things or replacing them with like a non-nutritively sweetened beverage or carbonated beverage. And so like,
that was a beautiful answer to a terrible question.
Right. And so I worry that like a lot of times things that we say have good intentions. Like I'm immediately thinking of admittedly the minority case, but the way that it goes wrong too. And I think this is like an inherent tension in public health nutrition. You'll see a lot of dietitians who are like so annoyed by like the sort of totally unnuanced public health nutrition sort of recommendations because it runs into problems for you clinically one-on-one working with the patients. Like most dietitians I know who have worked in cancer have seen at least one patient who's taken well-meaning public health nutrition advice and actively harmed themselves by like overly restricting foods while they're just not eating enough or in like a catabolic state already and don't need to be restricting food.
Just to jump in, it was so funny. I mean, my training is in public health, right? And I could tell you, just thinking back, I mean, it's been like 20 years or whatever since I was in grad school, but yeah, things were so oversimplified and it was like sugar bad. I remember we did those exhibits where you had a bottle of Coke and then you showed how many cups of sugar were in it, right? And it was just a very evil, all that stuff. And so you're right. I mean, there might be certain circumstances where we shouldn't be making those blanket statements. I really appreciate that.
Spoken like a true scientist.
Yes.
There's things though, even like outside of that, like that pediatric cancer thing might sound obscure, but like I meet athletes all the time who are like also really strictly adhering to some of these things. And I'm like, oh, like sugar is an ergogenic aid. Like it's one of the more studied things. Like you're taking creatine, like there's as much data for like relying on like a sucrose sweetened things as a source of calories. It's like can be helpful in your training. Yeah, like things like sugar. Like I've seen athletes who take things a little bit too far and they're like really restricting carbs and they're not using like sugar gel packets in the middle of races. Which like we're worried about sugar in the context of like particularly eating beyond your caloric requirement, but also
obesity and such.
Yeah, we're like there's a risk of like that fructose being, I mean, like metabolically, it's like a lipogenic fuel that might worsen like the amount of de novo lipogenesis that's occurring in the liver and the amount of fat in the liver, which impairs insulin signaling. And there's like all these like molecular reasons why, but like that is like a very specific context that it applies quite generally, but it doesn't quite to everyone. It's really those at risk of metabolic disease. And I'm like not typically worried in most cases of like my athlete clients or patients where I'm like, you can have the sugar gel packet in the middle of your 10-mile race. Yeah. Like, this is fine.
So the second part of what I had asked, and I'm going to jump in, and I know we're getting ready to wrap up here, but I was like, what would you recommend? And I would think an obvious thing that we're probably aligned on is we need to be eating more veggies and greens and fiber and things like that. And you were just recently on Dr. Mike's The Checkup podcast. And one of the, I thought it was really cool. You were talking at one point about supplements and things like athletic greens, AG1 or whatever it is. And how people will eat these things, drink these things to like sneak in, more greens and fiber into their diet. I mean, you did there was a longer conversation. Everyone should really tune into that episode. But I thought what was so interesting is you were talking about the ways that with marketing, what was it like they do it by milligram instead of by gram? I forget what you said, but just sort of inflate how much of that green is actually present. And then the other thing, then I'll shut up and I'll turn it over to you, was that if you actually took freeze-dried spinach, right, and actually like measured it out, it would be some like microscopic amount. Clearly, it would be more cost effective to just have some greens. I always just think like the people who actually are nutrient deficient are probably the ones who don't have access to these supplements and, like athletic greens, like they're not the ones having it. So I don't know. And can you just comment on that briefly?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of like class and diet issues that intersect with these like $100 a month green powder products, which it's not. I tried in my answer there to like make it not specific to AG1 because there's so many of these things out there. Like Huel has one. I mean, just like the amount of green powders out there as like a quick, easy way to get vegetables in. It's not really clear that it's doing all that. And like the benefits of vegetables, it's like partially what is in them, but it's also partially that they have a high water content, they're a low energy density, they bulk and make you feel full. And so like the degree to which that is on the causal pathway for why they are healthy for you, it's probable that it's an important component of it. And so when you're relying on a dehydrated powder that like maybe some of them are enough to like technically be the equivalent of like one serving of a vegetable, it's hard to say because they have these proprietary blends. Like it's okay. Well, it's not like a bulking thing anymore that is like making you feel full and not overeating too. So, yeah, I think, trying to remember exactly what your original question.
I don't remember what my question was. Yeah.
There's one thing I wanted to make clear. Like in nutrition, we focus a lot on the substitution. It's not like a drug, like where you'd say, yes, no, I'm going to take it. It's like, unless you're overeating and we're just saying stop eating this and keep everything else the same, like for the most part people eat on a day-to-day basis relatively within their caloric requirement. If you tell people just like eat less of one thing, you typically should tell them, well, eat more of this, because I think we told people to eat less of fat and they eat more of sugar largely at a population level, and we don't want those swaps. And so I think like focusing on things like if you're buying refined grains, like choosing the whole grain, or if there's a pasta, try out the legume-based pastas that are out there now, like things that are
well, those are actually delicious.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan personally, especially the edamame ones.
What?
Oh, I've not tried that one. I like the chickpea ones.
I like the chickpea ones too. Wait, edamame.
Love a chickpea one, but like a edamame one goes great with like a pesto.
Oh, man, I gotta try that.
Same.
And it's like edamame has a bit more protein and fiber than a chickpea does. I mean, I'm not partial to any single legume, and I'm going to reference that one.
Can't play favorites with their legumes.
I'm an edamame shill, but yeah, focusing on the swap I think is important, and this is where like I encourage people, like if you're spending hundreds of dollars a month on supplements, just take one of those months, go see a dietitian, and get like an individualized like. Let's talk through your diet. Let's do a full assessment of your medical history, your labs, and think about like what are just a few things that you can prioritize working on, and then practically working on like what are recipes? How do you like actively incorporate this into your lifestyle in a super individualized way, instead of these products that make it sound like it's like individualized to you, but it's actually like sold to everyone. I know a lot of coaches do this where they're like, I've got my supplement that you need, and here's my like code or whatever. And it feels very like one-on-one parasocial relationship. In reality, they're just doing this for everyone. And so I would say like get the actual individualized advice. Like maybe there is a supplement that you need because your diet is like a shortfall on something and you're low in calcium or whatever it is, or B12, and you can get that specific recommendation. And like something like AG1, I think it's got like 50 things in it. Or like, I think they in like 70 or something. So, and like not specific to AG1, all these powders, like you're just buying a catch-all that you hope is filling some gap and doing something, but we really don't know. So just, I think go see a qualified practitioner if you have the time and money to. But I think on a population level, I think we can generalize that like people do not eat enough fatty fish. We have been recommending this for ages, and it just does not happen. It does not matter if it is wild or farm raised. They're all good sources of the omega-3s that we want people to get in their diet. So those are really like that is, I think, something I feel safe saying. Most people are not eating enough fatty fish. Most people do not eat like any legume. And so we're eating tons of refined grains. We're eating a lot of added sugars and solid fats. And finding ways to swap these things out for some of these nutrients that are, or some of these foods that are rich in all the nutrients that we think are predictive for chronic disease risk, is ideal. And there's some general things I can say, but again, like going and seeing a practitioner, a lot of people don't even realize that their insurance might cover, like it's not as many dietitian visits as we would like a year for like long-term behavior. You can often get a visit at least partially covered under your insurance, depending on the type you have. So I would encourage that for folks if they're really like, go pursue this. Now that you listen to this episode and know what a dietitian is, hopefully you can go get a consult.
That's my big takeaway is I want to sign myself up immediately.
Right.
I think this was really amazing. Everyone needs to go follow Dr. Kevin Klatt. He's on social media. Is your handle at KC Klatt, Klatt?
Yep.
And we'll link to this in our show notes. Also, his Substack is an absolute treasure trove of really amazing evidence-based information. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us, Kevin. And thank you all for tuning in. We hope you learned a thing or two. I certainly did. Please join us next week on your trusted source for no nonsense, just science.